Gentlemen, thank you for a great interview from start to finish. I know our audience appreciated hearing Ciena's position on the edge. Now that we've gotten the service provider and vendor perspective, pushing the edge with our esteemed analysts seems like a natural next step. So here to dissect the edge computing market for us are David Strauss of Broadband Success Partners and Ian Redpath of Omdia. Gentlemen, over to you.
Hello, Ian Redpath here from Omdia, and I'm with David Strauss from Broadband Success Partners. David, how are you doing today?
Terrific. Great to be here, Ian.
Well, we're here today to talk about edge compute, and edge compute has really captured the industry's imagination. All the industry actors are involved, from the communication service provider community, the cloud and SaaS provider community, major data center operators, and even some startups are in the game. So edge compute will encompass many types of ecosystems, from software and application environments, orchestration for not only bandwidth, but also compute. It will involve the compute itself, bare metal, general purpose CPU, GPUs, and edge compute will even be a real estate play, and topics such as carbon neutral power generation will come up as well. And of course, for the bandwidth community, we expect major change and major growth from low latency fan-in bandwidth coming from the enterprise side and the computer side, and also more growth on the, what I like to call the terabit data center interconnect core. So traction has already begun from some of the major CSPs, and even startups are already in the game. So my first question for you, David, is you've already conducted some insightful market research into the edge compute marketplace. Could you share a little bit with us and help us frame it up from the perspective of definitions and locations?
Sure, Ian. Thanks for that question. We interviewed about 24 cable executives, tier 1 and tier 2 in North America. And regarding the definition of edge compute, it really was fairly split in that, 44% of those defined it as transforming head ends and hub sites to mini data centers, otherwise known as HERD, or head end re-architected as a data center. Next up, 30% viewed it as distributed compute and virtualization via DAA, or what we know as distributed access architecture, and or flexible MAC architecture, or FMA. And almost as many executives, close to that 30%, noted that they need to build new edge sites. And our view as to why the answer is varied as they did was really probably the mindset the interviewee, the executive, was in when we asked the question. If they were thinking about an application where that required, ultra low latency, such as autonomous vehicles or AR, VR, for example, then they were in the headset of a more distributed architecture, and thus having edge even closer, if you will, or the edge compute even closer to the end user. However, if they were thinking of things such as video caching or SD-WAN, perhaps a less distributed architecture, and thus answered that question differently. As far as the locations are concerned, it was really a split between head ends and hub sites as being the primary locations that were picked. And we asked this question as to why you picked the answer you did. And this one answer really encapsulates what many of the executives had to say or were thinking. It really depends on the tipping point of the finances of or the investment in edge compute versus the actual tolerance for latency. So it's really optimizing between those two factors as to where they believe the hardware needed to be. So, Ian, a question for you. What are the key drivers for MEC under discussion in the industry today?
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, I think the key enabler, and you touched on it already, is absolutely low latency. I mean, the purpose of edge compute is to shift the data and the decisions closer to the users and the devices to enable that superior user experience. So, moving to low latency is absolute paramount. The big driver, of course, is the big driver that we always have in this sector, and that's revenue. So it's the combination of revenues that we see today and revenues that have yet to be defined for future applications that have not yet been envisioned yet. So that's really the big prize is getting a larger slice of digital economy revenues enabled by low latency. And that's also important to keep in mind that there's a lot invested in terms of protecting today's revenue. Today in the gaming environment, in the video delivery environment, users have really heightened expectations around performance, and they're very, very sensitive to it. And so if they get the sense that one network will perform better than another, they'll move very, very quickly. So there's a lot of a revenue protection aspect involved here as well. And then there are other drivers, beyond that. I mean, drivers in terms of, rapidly being able to scale operational and capital efficiencies. So it really encompasses the entire ROI for the carrier community. So David, back to you. From your perspective, what are some of the really intriguing use cases that have been bubbling up from your perspective?
Thanks, Ian. Well, video caching is fairly widespread with, over the top and streaming and so on. So when we asked this question, we said, given that that's already pretty pervasive, what are the next use cases you're anticipating to really drive service providers to go further toward the edge? And not a surprise, cloud gaming is that primary edge use case. And as we well know, given the circumstances associated with COVID-19 and the lockdown, video gaming has really accelerated at a hyper pace, if you will. And thus, that's a use case that's accelerating the need for edge compute. Next up, healthcare and sensors, massive IoT. That also popped near the top, if you will, as a use case. And equally popular was surveillance and physical security. So next up, question for you, Ian. Carrier monetization is a central and key topic in this area. What are your thoughts on carrier monetization?
Yeah, thank you, David. And yes, it is really back to the whole ROI. So, for the carrier community, the investment ask on edge compute will just continue to expand over time. I mean, today's edge compute sites from the major CSPs are relatively defined and contained. Tomorrow's are going to be more numerous and diverse. Today's sites, a little bit. We're talking in terms of edge, but the grand scheme of things, they're a little bit more centralized. They can be staffed. Tomorrow's are likely to be much more distributed, remote, and very likely, unstaffed or occasionally staffed. So their costs are going to rise, and real estate costs will rise, and the big concern is OpEx costs rising. So when I look at some of the revenues that are being talked about today, they're all very well and good. Of course, space, power, things like remote hands, potentially bare metal, premium bandwidth. So the revenues to be sure, but to me, the real idea would be to get a slice of that true digital economy top line. If they could tap into those revenue streams more directly, then it will just make the entire case a lot more appealing. And then that could flow, back into the CapEx cycle, and a virtuous circle can be set up. I think the way forward there is likely more of a partnership model and a partnership mindset. And one angle that may be a path forward is really around the mission critical and the cannot fail. Like we do talk about consumer types of services. Those are all well and good and will drive revenue and then in turn drive investment. But think about services that are the criticality is taking up a whole level. And in that environment, I think the CSPs will have more leverage, to set the terms and tap into that digital economy revenue uplift. So monetization is absolutely central to the whole discussion. So kind of throwing it back to you, we've talked a little bit about monetization. What are some of the other challenges that are key in the whole edge compute market development from your perspective?
Thanks, Ian. Well, just to confirm, as you noted, monetization is in fact key. And when we asked these executives, the 24 executives, what challenges were greatest, the number one had to do with monetization, as it so happens. 42% noted that having the operations in place to supporting monetization of new service and business models was in fact the greatest challenge. Though after that, adaptability came in at about a quarter of the executives, citing that as a key challenge, meaning knowing when and where to adjust and adapt network resources. On the heels of that, at 17%, was what was known as resources to support and manage the edge compute facilities. And then next after that was actual performance, delivering the low latency requirements of edge compute. So that's sort of the landscape, if you will, as to the challenges that these executives are experiencing and plan to experience, in the near future as they move in a faster pace toward edge compute. So next up, let me ask about, from your vantage point, what are you seeing, Ian, vis-a-vis the timing with regards to the speed with which the players are getting into the game?
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, this is a really interesting question, and I think the answer really depends on who you're asking and their perspective and their lens already. So we've talked about some of the major tier ones that are already into the dozens. I think rapidly getting to hundreds of sites. If you talk about some of the other industry actors, they're going to give you a completely different answer. if you went to an Acabai and you mentioned the CDN world, I really like the way that they put edge compute. They like to cite the CDN, their CDN business is the first revenue generating edge compute use case. And the Akamai network is well over 4,000 sites. So a significant network has already been in place and in place for many years. And then if you maybe take a look at a company such as Rakuten, and listen to the way they're building out their radio network, utilizing the cloud, they're talking about targeting 10,000 sites in their own domestic market. So, we've got some different numbers out there, and it kind of depends on the timing as well. So the way I like to look at it is that the far edge market development is really a multivariate business and network planning challenge, and it will take time to really scale out. One of the interesting numbers that we've been hearing in a European context is potentially getting to tens of thousands of far edge micro type sites, for a European country economy. So, bringing this all back to bandwidth, this is going to drive a lot of growth and a lot of change. And, just summarizing from the perspective of our bandwidth community, as we mentioned in the beginning, we expect enterprise and fan-in bandwidth. So all the types of bandwidth that we know and love today. We could see enterprises coming in at modest levels, the 50 meg, 200 meg, the gig and whatnot. But we expect that to absolutely grow and scale. And then on the core side, really when we're looking at some of these larger edge compute sites, I'm thinking in terms of 100 gig and 100 gig for each physical fiber route that's at a facility, and that's just the beginning. That's the starting point. 100 gig for each route, and it just grows from there. So we are talking about a tremendous amount of bandwidth. So on behalf of David and myself, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, David.